Imagine waking up one morning, rubbing your eyes, stepping outside, and realizing the sun hasn't risen. Not just today. Not yesterday. Not even last week. The sky is a grim, smoky grey, like someone turned down the brightness on the entire planet. It's cold, unnaturally cold, and your crops? Dead. People are panicking. Whispers of omens, gods, and the end of the world echo through the streets. Welcome to the year 536 AD, the year many scientists now call the worst time to be alive. Before we journey into this apocalypse on Earth, hit that like button, subscribe if you're into weird, dark history, and comment below. What modern convenience would you miss most if the sun vanished for a year? Okay, ready to descend into the dark? Let's begin. Imagine waking up in the quiet pre-dawn stillness, stepping out of your modest wooden home, and looking up, only to see a sky that looks like it needs therapy. No sunrise. No color. Just a thick, ghostly grey stretching from horizon to horizon, as though someone smeared ashes across the heavens. That was the reality for people across the globe in the year 536 AD. There were no breaking news alerts, no tweets, no weather channels to warn people that something deeply wrong had happened to the world. All they had was instinct, and instinct was screaming, "Something is not right." Historical records from this time tell us one haunting truth. The sun disappeared, or at least it might as well have. It wasn't a single day of darkness. It wasn't a week. It was months. Eerie, dim daylight that never felt quite like day. It was as if the sun had called in sick for the rest of the year, and Earth had no backup plan. The Byzantine historian Procopius, a man not known for exaggeration, wrote, "The sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during the whole year." Now, Procopius wasn't just being poetic. This was a real observation, echoed from Europe to Asia. Chinese court scribes noted strange, persistent fogs and summer snows. Irish monks recorded a failure of bread in the annals, aka famine. All across the northern hemisphere, crops withered, people starved, and no one could understand what was going on. Imagine you're a 6th century farmer. Your whole world is dependent on growing food. There's no global supply chain, no Amazon Prime to send you lentils. If your barley doesn't sprout, your children don't eat. Now imagine trying to plant in a spring that feels like midwinter. And by summer, the chill still hasn't left the air. Your fields are silent, empty. The earth, usually teeming with life, is cracked and bare. That's what people lived through. And the fear, palpable. Religion, mythology, and rumor filled in the blanks. Some believed it was divine punishment. Others whispered of dragons, eclipses, or cosmic imbalance. The science didn't exist yet to say, "Ah yes, we're in a global volcanic winter." But that's exactly what it was. Fast forward to modern times, and scientists began digging, sometimes literally, for the truth. Ice cores taken from glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica revealed layers rich in volcanic glass particles. That's basically nature's forensic report, showing massive volcanic eruptions around the year 536. And we're not talking about one polite little puff of ash. These were supervolcanoes, possibly in Iceland or Central America, that threw so much ash and sulfur into the sky, it created a planetary sunshade. A grim, uninvited one. One researcher likened it to a nuclear winter without the war. The particles reflected sunlight back into space, drastically lowering global temperatures. Some regions cooled by as much as 3 degrees Celsius, or nearly 6 degrees Fahrenheit, which might not sound like much until you remember that this was a world already dancing on the edge of survival. And remember, this was just the beginning. The cold, the crop failures, the starvation. They led to further disasters. Pandemics, migrations, wars. But we'll get to that. For now, picture the psychological toll. For over a year, people lived under that oppressive grey sky. No warm sun on your face. No clear moonlit nights. No real seasons. Just a murky, dreamless twilight. And you have to remember, humans are solar creatures. The sun regulates everything from crops to hormones. Without it, people likely struggled with sleep, mood, and a general sense of doom. If seasonal affective disorder existed back then, the entire population probably had it. Full-blown, no-filter depression, with zero vitamin D supplements to help. So what did they do? Well, most prayed. Some panicked. Others adapted. They stored what food they could. They burned more fuel to survive the cold. Communities relied on tradition, ritual, and religion to make sense of the senseless. After all, if your world goes dark and cold and lifeless for no reason, wouldn't you start asking the heavens for answers? And just when they thought things couldn't get worse, they did. Before we move on, take a second to reflect. What would you do if the sun disappeared for a year? Would you hoard candles? Build an indoor garden? Form a cult and declare yourself high priest of the flashlight? Let me know in the comments. And if you're enjoying this slow dive into history's weirdest weather event, don't forget to like and subscribe. It keeps the sun metaphorically shining here. Let's pick up where we left off. The sun's gone weird, temperatures are dropping, crops are dying, and no one knows why. But let's take a step back and ask the question our ancestors couldn't. What actually happened in 536 AD? To solve this mystery, we don't look at ancient scrolls, we look at ice. Yep, the cold kind. Scientists took core samples from glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica, like drilling deep down into a freezer that's been running for thousands of years. What they found was chilling. Literally. Inside the layers of ancient ice were signs of massive volcanic eruptions. We're talking enormous quantities of sulfur and microscopic shards of volcanic glass, what scientists lovingly call tephra. These weren't signs of just any volcano. These were the fingerprints of what might have been one of the most catastrophic eruptions in human history. And it wasn't just one boom. It was a series of eruptions, like the earth got a chest cold and couldn't stop coughing. The first, and probably biggest, eruption likely happened in early 536, somewhere near Iceland. That would explain the northern hemisphere plunging into what scientists call a volcanic winter. Think Mount Pinatubo in 1991. But several times worse. The sulfur dioxide blasted into the stratosphere mixed with water vapor to form aerosols, which then spread around the globe, blocking sunlight like an atmospheric blackout curtain. It's like Earth suddenly put on a pair of really dark sunglasses and refused to take them off. Temperatures dropped, harvests failed, and economies crumbled. But just when things might have begun to recover, another eruption hit in 540 AD. Then again in 547. It was a 1-2-3 punch of ash, acid rain, and climate chaos. Scientists say it may have caused the coldest decade in over 2,000 years. But let's bring this home. Let's talk, people. You're a 6th century villager. Your livelihood is entirely based on whether or not you can grow enough food to survive the winter. But now the seasons have lost their script. Spring doesn't show up. Summer feels like fall. The soil's cold and stubborn, and your sheep aren't even shedding properly because they think it's still January. There are no food banks. There's no global trade to bail you out. You can't order takeout. If your neighbor's grain bin looks suspiciously full, you either beg, barter, or, well, Let's just say things sometimes get uncivilized. Now multiply that across continents, across thousands of communities. You've got a global humanitarian crisis in a time when the word global wasn't even a concept yet. And guess what? With starvation comes something else. Migration. When people can't feed their families, they move. Sometimes peacefully, often not. Entire tribes and nations began to shift and clash during this period. Some historians believe this climatic disaster accelerated the fall of empires and the rise of others. It may have helped push the final collapse of the Western Roman Empire and opened doors for new powers to emerge. Even in China, imperial records describe famines, strange weather, and mass discontent. Dust storms in the north, floods in the south, locusts, disease. People wrote poems begging the heavens for answers. But as we now know, the heavens were just full of smoke and volcanic spit. Now, let's get dark. Literally and figuratively. Do you know what follows famine? Disease. Your immune system is weakened. Your neighbors are dying. Hygiene. Not really a 6th century specialty. Bodies weren't always buried properly. Water wasn't clean. Combine that with a cool, damp climate, and you've got the perfect breeding ground for something truly nasty. And in a few chapters, we'll get to one of the deadliest pandemics in human history that came right after this, the Plague of Justinian. But let's not sprint there just yet. Here's the wild thing. While all of this was unfolding, people didn't even know the cause. They didn't say, "Ah yes, an Icelandic volcano just plunged the world into darkness." No, they were guessing, blaming, fearing. Some thought it was divine punishment. Others thought it was sorcery, demons, or signs of an incoming apocalypse. Imagine trying to get through the worst year of your life, and not even knowing why it's happening. We take a lot for granted in the modern world. If the sky turns orange, Twitter's already filled with satellite images. If there's an eruption in Tonga, you can watch it on YouTube with HD drone footage. But in 536 AD, you just sat there, shivering under a wool blanket, hoping your goat survived the night. Let's take a moment to appreciate how far we've come, and how fragile our systems still are. Because if this happened again, the ash, the darkness, the chill, even today, it would be disastrous. Satellites would fail, planes would be grounded, global crop production would plummet, and in a world of 8 billion people, food scarcity could spiral out of control in weeks. History may not repeat itself exactly, but it certainly has a rhythm, and in 536, that rhythm was ash, hunger, and cold. We'll explore more of its ripple effects soon, including how this hazy apocalypse set the stage for a deadly plague, economic collapse, and maybe even the birth of new religions. But first, breathe in. Imagine that still, grey air, the heavy silence of a world without sunlight. And now, exhale. You've just survived the beginning of the worst year in human history. If you thought things couldn't get any worse after the sky went dark in 536, oh friend, welcome to 541. The sun was still playing hide and seek, the air was still unervingly cold, and most of the known world was in some stage of famine. Crops had failed, livestock had starved, people were desperate. Now add this to the mix, a horrifying illness sweeping across continents, dropping entire cities into silence. Yes, this is the chapter where we meet the other major player of the apocalypse, the Plague of Justinian. Now, quick question. When you think of plague, what comes to mind? Most people immediately picture the Black Death of the 14th century. Rats, beaks, bells, all that gloomy jazz. But long before that horror show, The plague of Justinian was already setting records for death and despair. Named after the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I, this plague hit the Eastern Roman Empire like a wrecking ball dipped in pus. Let's set the scene. It's the early 540s, and Justinian is at the peak of his rule. He's trying to reconquer lost Western Roman territories, rebuild the glory of the empire, and basically go full, I'm in charge of the known world. But then people in the port cities start getting sick. Really sick. And it spreads. Fast. Symptoms began with a fever and chills, progressed to swollen lymph nodes, called buboes, especially in the armpits, neck, and groin. Sound familiar? Yep. This was the first historically documented appearance of bubonic plague, caused by Yersinia pestis, the same bacteria behind the Black Death. It's like the Earth said, "Oh, so you're hungry and freezing? Cool. Let me throw in a bonus disease just to really spice things up." Contemporary accounts described entire neighborhoods collapsing under silence. People died too quickly for anyone to bury them. Corpses were left in the streets, stacked in buildings, or tossed into the sea. At its peak, Constantinople, the capital, was reportedly losing 5,000 to 10,000 people per day. To give that some modern perspective, imagine if your entire city suddenly smelled like a hospital left out in the sun. Now imagine that hospital didn't have any nurses, doctors, or antibiotics. Just terror and a lot of incense. Justinian himself caught the plague, and somehow survived. But his empire didn't recover quite so easily. Let's talk numbers. Historians estimate that the plague of Justinian may have killed 25 to 50 million people across the Mediterranean and parts of Europe and Asia. That's up to half the population of the Byzantine Empire at the time. It came in waves too, like a really terrible sequel that no one asked for. The first outbreak lasted for about 4 years, but smaller resurgences would occur for nearly 2 centuries afterward. Now remember, this happened on the heels of an already devastated planet. The volcanic winter had weakened societies. People were malnourished. Immunity, practically non-existent. Sanitation. Let's just say the Romans were good at aqueducts, but not so great at germ theory. So when the plague arrived, people were completely defenseless. No masks. No vaccines. No Zoom funerals. And just like the volcanic fallout, they didn't know why it was happening. Some blamed foreigners. Others said it was God's punishment. In Constantinople, Emperor Justinian ordered prayers, processions, and even exorcisms of the wind, thinking evil air carried the disease. Which, to be fair, isn't entirely wrong. Germs do ride air currents, but it's not exactly wash-your-hands science. As the bodies piled up, burial became a logistical nightmare. At one point, they resorted to using mass graves dug along the seawalls, and even those overflowed. The government paid gravediggers double wages, triple, if they didn't run away screaming first. The empire faltered. Wars were abandoned. Trade routes broke down. Agriculture ground to a halt. Some historians argue that this plague marked the beginning of the end for the Roman world as it had existed. But what about the ordinary people? Imagine you're a poor laborer in Constantinople. You've already lived through years of cold summers and empty grain bins. You've watched your neighbors waste away from starvation. Now a cough starts, and within a few days your whole family is gone. You walk the streets and hear nothing. Not a child crying. Not a merchant haggling. Just the rustle of rats and the prayers of priests who are burying their 10th body of the week. This wasn't just a public health disaster. It was an emotional cataclysm. We often talk about these moments in terms of numbers. Millions dead, half a continent affected. But imagine the psychological toll of seeing your city decay into silence. Your leaders are helpless. Your gods feel absent. The sky is still grey. The air still cold. It must have felt like the end of the world. And maybe, in some ways, it was. But here's the thing about humans. We don't quit easily. Despite all of this, people endured. They planted again. They rebuilt. They raised new leaders, wrote new songs, carved out new myths. And in doing so, they started reshaping civilization into something new. Still, in this chapter of history, it's hard not to feel the weight of it all. A sick planet, sick people, and sick systems, crumbling under the pressure of forces they couldn't name or understand. As we move to the next chapter, we'll leave the plague-ridden cities and look out across the broader consequences of all this turmoil. The fall of empires, the rise of new faiths, and the surprising ways this decade of darkness shaped the modern world. But for now, if you made it this far, take a breath. You just lived through volcanic winter and the first global pandemic. You deserve a nap. Or at least a strong herbal tea. Question for you. If you were emperor and the plague hit your city, what would you do? Comment below. We're building our own survival guide, one hypothetical at a time. And if you're finding this journey through darkness oddly relaxing, go ahead and subscribe. We've still got a long night ahead. By now, you're bundled in your metaphorical wool cloak, clutching your candle, and wondering, how did any civilization survive this mess? Short answer, they didn't. Not all of them. Let's zoom out and take a long, slow look at the political landscape in the aftermath of the volcanic winter and plague tsunami of the 6th century. Because when your crops fail, your skies stay grey, and your people die by the thousands. Sooner or later, your empire starts to wobble. And if that empire already has a few cracks, well, 536 AD was like handing it a sledgehammer and saying, good luck. We'll start with the Byzantine Empire, aka the Eastern Roman Empire, where Emperor Justinian was still limping along after recovering from the plague himself. Before all this chaos began, Justinian had big dreams: reunite the Roman Empire, revive its glory, expand its reach. Think of him as the Steve Jobs of ancient emperors, charismatic, ambitious, obsessed with legacy. And for a moment, it looked like he might pull it off. He had military victories under his belt. He built the Hagia Sophia, one of the greatest architectural wonders of the medieval world. He passed sweeping legal reforms with the Corpus Juris Civilis, a legal code that still echoes through modern law. But then, nature happened. First, the skies darkened. Grain imports from Egypt faltered. Food prices soared. Then, the plague hit, cutting down soldiers, officials, farmers, builders, everyone. Entire branches of government ground to a halt. The tax base collapsed. Armies starved, mutinied, or just wandered home. Justinian's plans? Toasted in ash. And remember those reconquests of Italy and North Africa? They were expensive. Very expensive. And once the empire was broke and bleeding, guess what? Barbarians started knocking. One historian compared Justinian's empire to a sick man trying to hold a sword. It might still have been technically alive, but it couldn't fight off the next round of invasions. The Lombards swept into Italy. The Slavs and Avars pushed into the Balkans. Even the Persians smelled weakness and attacked from the east. Now zoom over to the Western Roman remnants, or what was left of them. Rome itself had been sacked decades earlier, and the Western Empire was already splintered into small kingdoms. But the aftershocks of 536 didn't just worsen existing cracks, they shattered whole societies. In Britain, archaeological records show signs of sudden village abandonment. Grain storage pits went unused. Trade networks collapsed. Many historians believe that the struggle after 536 helped push Britain into what's often called the sub-Roman Dark Age, a murky period where written records vanished and kingdoms splintered. In Scandinavia, things took a truly eerie turn. Picture this. You're trudging through a mossy Nordic forest. The air smells like pine and damp earth. And suddenly, you stumble on a site where dozens of precious objects were intentionally buried or destroyed. Swords bent, golden jewelry smashed, buried deep into the earth. For a while, archaeologists were baffled. Why would people destroy their most valuable belongings? Then they realized, these weren't robberies. They were sacrifices. Starting around 536 AD, Norse tribes began what can only be described as an existential panic. Some communities started sacrificing their wealth, possibly even people, to appease the gods. One theory suggests they thought Ragnarok, the end of the world in Norse mythology, had begun. Honestly, given the sun had disappeared and the earth was freezing over, it's not a wild conclusion. And then there's Mesoamerica, thousands of miles away, yet not immune. Tree ring and ice core data suggest the volcanic climate effects reached the Maya region too. Crop stress, droughts, cultural disruptions. Though they didn't leave written records saying, "Hey, thanks for nothing, Iceland volcano," signs of trouble are scattered across the land. So this wasn't just a Roman problem. This wasn't just a European problem. This was a global unraveling. Civilizations that had been stable for centuries suddenly staggered. Social orders faltered. Belief systems were tested. It was like the entire planet was thrown into an unscripted dress rehearsal for the end times. And what about the ordinary people caught in the middle of it all? They got creative. In some regions, communities returned to barter systems because currency had lost value or simply wasn't circulating. In others, local warlords or charismatic prophets rose to power, offering hope, or at least food, in exchange for loyalty. People fled cities, moving back to rural settlements. Urban life, once seen as the pinnacle of civilization, became a dangerous liability. The world, in essence, hit the reset button. Not by choice, not by design, but by the sheer, crushing weight of volcanic ash, death, and disease. Now here's a haunting thought. The people living through this had no idea what caused it. They didn't know about tephra or sulfuric aerosols or Icelandic eruptions. They couldn't Google, "Why is the sun dim?" or post desperate TikToks about farming tips during eternal winter. All they could do was survive. And yet, despite the chaos, the world did move forward. In the next chapter, we'll explore how out of this darkness, new faiths, ideas, and cultures began to rise. Because sometimes, the worst years don't just destroy, they plant the seeds of transformation. But before we go, if you were the ruler of a crumbling empire, what would you do first? Feed the people or rebuild the army? Let me know in the comments. There are no wrong answers, only complicated ones. And hey, if this story has pulled you in, like a history book laced with mystery, hit that subscribe button. We've only just survived the ash. Now we'll see what grew from it. So far, we've watched the skies turn grey, empires falter, and plagues sweep through cities like an invisible scythe. But what happens inside a human being when the world stops making sense? Welcome to one of the most quietly powerful consequences of the year 536. A spiritual revolution. Imagine you're an average villager in the 6th century. The sky hasn't looked normal in months. Your crops are stunted. You've buried more than one family member. Disease is whispered about like it's a living thing lurking in doorways. You don't understand the science. No one does. You just know the light is wrong, the world feels cursed, and your leaders are no longer in control. What do you turn to? Answer: faith. superstition, meaning, anything that makes it all feel less random. Now, don't misunderstand. Religion wasn't new in 536. Christianity was already well established in the Eastern Roman Empire. In Persia, Zoroastrianism thrived. In India and beyond, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism were flourishing. In Mecca, long before Islam rose to power, local polytheistic cults dominated. But something changed in this time of fear and famine. Faith wasn't just a background feature, it became a lifeline. Let's start with Christianity in the Byzantine world. Before the plague and the volcanic winter, Christianity had already evolved from a persecuted fringe religion into a central political power. But disasters have a way of testing belief, and also amplifying it. When the sun failed and people started dying, churches filled, prayers multiplied. Religious processions through plague-ridden streets became common, with priests chanting for divine mercy as bodies were carted away behind them. People didn't always understand disease, but they did understand sin and punishment. The logic went like this: the darker the skies, the darker the world's soul must be. It wasn't volcanic ash blotting out the sun, it was God, ashamed of his creation. It was during this period that the Byzantine Church began leaning harder into apocalyptic texts, prophecies, visions, end-times thinking. The Book of Revelation, dusty and dramatic, got pulled off the shelf and taken very, very literally. And let's be honest, if you lived in a world where even the sun seemed to be giving up, you might start quoting Revelation too. Meanwhile, in the Persian Empire, Zoroastrianism's battle between light and darkness suddenly hit differently. The faith's central belief in a cosmic war between good, Ahura Mazda, and evil, Engra Mainyu, echoed eerily through a world where light was losing. Priests interpreted the gloom as a sign of growing evil, perhaps even the prophesied final conflict. Rituals intensified. Fire temples became sanctuaries of hope. Over in India, Buddhist and Hindu communities also felt the pressure. Monks recorded strange omens. Certain calendars were adjusted to reflect what they thought was cosmic imbalance. Offerings increased. Pilgrimages, once rare and elite, became more common among the desperate poor. And here's where it gets fascinating. While most people turned inward to their own faiths, others turned outward, seeking new truths. In some regions, spiritual experimentation blossomed. New sects and movements popped up. Local prophets, some real, some opportunistic, claimed to know why the darkness had come and what must be done to survive it. Some warned of divine retribution. Others promised paradise through devotion. In parts of Europe, you even begin to see the early roots of medieval mysticism, an emphasis on visions, signs, dreams. People believed angels were visiting them, that saints were speaking through storms, that their fevered hallucinations were messages from the divine. Was it spiritual awakening or mass trauma? Maybe both. But either way, something was stirring. Let's not forget the North, where the Norse had their own interpretation of the crisis. According to Norse myth, the end of the world, Ragnarok, would begin when the sun and moon were devoured, winter would stretch for years, and gods would die in battle. Sound familiar? The volcanic skies of 536 perfectly mirrored those prophecies. The Fimbulwinter, a legendary, unending winter, seemed to have arrived, and in response, the people gave offerings. Not just livestock, not just gold. In some regions, there's evidence of massive ritual sacrifices, perhaps even humans, because when nature behaves like mythology, people stop thinking symbolically. They start preparing for war, or the end, or both. This spiritual shift had consequences that would stretch far beyond the decade. In a way, the trauma of 536 and the years that followed tilled the soil, And not just literally, but spiritually. New religious movements and philosophies began to sprout. By the 7th century, Islam would rise in Arabia, offering both a religious and societal transformation. Christianity, too, would splinter and spread in new directions. Eastern philosophies expanded. Mysticism grew. You could say that out of darkness, humanity found new light, not from the sun, but from within. And in times like those, that light had to be enough. So what does this chapter tell us? That we're meaning-making creatures. When the physical world collapses, the emotional and spiritual worlds step in to fill the void. Sometimes beautifully, sometimes dangerously, but always with one core question echoing beneath it all. Why is this happening to us? In the next chapter, we'll explore how that question wasn't just spiritual, it was political, because as kings died and cities emptied, new leaders rose from the ashes. But before we go, what would you believe if the sun vanished for a year? Would you turn to ancient texts, invent your own religion, start a cult devoted to flashlights and solar panels? Let me know in the comments. And remember, if you're enjoying this tale of disaster and resilience, hit that like button and subscribe. There's a lot more darkness to explore. But don't worry, we'll light the way. Close your eyes for a moment and picture a horizon that never truly wakes. Day after day, week after week, the skies remain grey, not with the beauty of storm clouds or the soft gloom of early dawn, but with a heavy, ashen haze, the kind that sits on your skin like memory, thick and strange, dulling the light and the soul alike. This was the atmosphere across much of the known world in the year 536. In the Mediterranean, farmers gazed up, squinting into a sun that barely cast shadows. In what is now China, court records noted strange frost in midsummer. In Ireland, crops failed and hunger crept quietly into homes. From Syria to Scandinavia, the planet had been wrapped in a veil of volcanic ash. But unlike a sudden earthquake or a blazing comet, the volcanic winter of 536 didn't roar into history with a dramatic entrance. It whispered, it drifted, it lingered. Let's slow down and look at what this actually felt like, not from a scientist's journal, but from a villager's weary eyes. You awaken, wrapped in linen, rising from your straw mat to a morning that looks wrong. The rooster crows, but there is no golden spill of light. Just a dim, cold mist that seems to ooze from the air itself. The hearth is cold, and it takes more wood than usual to warm your small stone cottage. Smoke curls from chimneys across your village, slow and lazy, almost unwilling to rise. You step outside. The trees look as though they've been brushed with soot. Your neighbor is already trying to stir her garden. Nothing grew well last year. Maybe this time it will be different. You both know it won't be. And above, the sky is the color of wet wool. Historians now call it a volcanic winter. But in those days, there was no label, just dread. From a scientific standpoint, this was the Earth's cooling response to an atmospheric catastrophe. The sun was being dimmed by a thick layer of volcanic aerosols, particles ejected high into the stratosphere that blocked solar radiation. Think of it as nature's sunglasses, except you can't take them off, and instead of looking cool, the world gets colder. Colder than most had ever experienced. In Europe, Procopius wrote of a sun that gave no light, as if it were in eclipse, even at noon. He wasn't being poetic. This was the sky's reality. Tree rings from Irish oaks and Scandinavian pines showed dramatically stunted growth. Crops suffered. Grains, which entire societies depended on, simply refused to flourish. By now, you're probably wondering, which volcano caused this? Ah, the mystery. For a long time, scientists pointed fingers like suspicious neighbors after a storm. Iceland, perhaps, or Central America. But with ice core data from Greenland and Antarctica, many now believe it began with a cataclysmic eruption in modern-day Iceland, followed possibly by another in El Salvador or Indonesia. Imagine that, multiple massive eruptions in a short span, like the Earth sneezing several times in a row. Violently, ash from these eruptions floated around the globe, wrapping continents in its quiet, invisible fingers. And silence. Birdsong diminished in many regions. Animals changed their migratory paths. Lakes and rivers froze over earlier and stayed frozen longer. The snow stayed well past its welcome. Imagine entire villages looking out each day, hoping for change, hoping for a patch of blue sky, or even the simple joy of casting a shadow again. Now let's return to that villager. It's the third winter of strange skies. Food stores are low. People begin migrating south. Some speak of gods angered by human pride. Others blame celestial alignments. Everyone agrees on one thing. The world has changed. A soft kind of panic sets in. Not the dramatic, Hollywood kind, but the kind that settles in behind your ribs and makes sleep difficult. It's the fear that next harvest will be no better, that your child might not survive the next frost. And still, no one understands why. We do now. Thanks to modern science, we can analyze sulfur levels in ice cores, match dates across ancient texts, and reconstruct the puzzle. But for the people of 536, all they had was cold comfort. Literally. Even in Constantinople, the great Byzantine capital, candles flickered all day in the emperor's court. Messengers arrived bearing grim news from the provinces. Famine here, blight there. And in the markets, coins changed hands for dwindling sacks of barley and wheat. Everything was becoming more expensive, but hope was cheap and scarce. The volcanic winter didn't just alter agriculture. It shook the rhythms of life itself. Religious leaders warned of apocalyptic times. Astrologers read the skies with growing dread. In some regions, new cults emerged, offering solace through strange rites or new philosophies. Because when the sun disappears and the earth grows stingy, people begin to look for deeper reasons. And here's a question for you. What would you believe if every day the world looked dimmer than the last? It's one thing to read about climate disasters. It's another to live in one. In the next chapter, we'll step even deeper into this historical storm, because when crops fail and cold creeps in, illness often follows. And in the years that followed 536, a new horror emerged, one that would leave millions buried in its shadow. But for now, take a breath. Feel the chill of a sky gone mute. Hear the silence between breaths, between footsteps, between prayers whispered into ashen air. The world hasn't ended, but it's forgotten how to smile. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest thing of all. Imagine waking up every morning and never seeing the sunrise. Not once. Not for weeks. Not for months. The rooster still crows, the cows still shuffle in the barn, but overhead, the sky is the color of wet ash. A thick grey veil clings to the air, heavy and unmoving, like the world forgot how to blink. This was life in 536 AD, and in this chapter, we're going to sit with that twilight. Not the sparkly vampire kind. We mean a literal, endless dimness that blanketed much of the world. Because if one thing made 536 truly horrific, it wasn't just the disease or the starvation. It was the light, or rather, the lack of it. Let's take a moment to breathe. Now, imagine you're a farmer in Constantinople. It's midsummer. You step outside expecting the usual brightness of day, but instead, It's like early dusk. The air is chilled, even though it should be warm. You look up, but the sun is nothing more than a faint disk, barely cutting through a ghostly fog that hovers in the sky. You wait, but it doesn't change. The next day, same thing. And the next. And the next. For 18 months, the sun barely showed its face. One Byzantine historian, Procopius, wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon. In today's terms, it was like someone turned down the world's brightness, setting to 20%. People panicked. Priests called it divine punishment. Pagans said it was a bad omen. Astrologers scrambled to interpret it. Farmers, they just looked at their shriveling crops and knew this would be a bad year. Let's talk volcanoes. Because while our medieval ancestors had no clue what was happening, modern science does. In the early 2000s, glaciologists studying ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica found something peculiar. Trapped within the ancient layers of ice from around the year 536 were massive deposits of sulfate aerosols, chemicals that don't just fall from the sky like confetti. These pointed to something cataclysmic. A massive volcanic eruption, somewhere near the tropics, had launched particles so high into the atmosphere that they circled the globe. These aerosols, essentially volcanic ash and sulfur dioxide, created a global veil in the stratosphere, blocking sunlight from reaching the Earth's surface, like putting sunglasses on the planet. And these weren't cute designer shades. These were full blackout curtains for the sun. The result? A dramatic drop in global temperatures. Crops failed across the northern hemisphere. China reported summer snow and failed rice harvests. Ireland's Annals of Ulster note a failure of bread, a gentle medieval euphemism for famine. But wait, let's make it relatable. Imagine you're planning a backyard barbecue, and suddenly the sun just doesn't show up. For a year. Your grill's cold. Your garden's dead. You keep opening the weather app, and it just says, perpetual gloom. High, 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Low, panic. Even worse, you're living in a world without fridges, global trade, or meteorologists. No one can explain what's going on. You just know the world is acting strange, and it's only getting stranger. So, where exactly was this volcano? We're not 100% sure, but recent studies suggest a massive eruption, possibly in Iceland or Central America. Other contenders include Ilopango in El Salvador or an unknown volcano in Indonesia. What we do know is this: whatever erupted had to be colossal. It launched ash into the stratosphere, high enough to avoid washing out in local weather patterns, and instead wrap itself around the entire Earth like a dark shawl. And then it happened again. Yes, in 540 AD, and again in 547 AD, more eruptions occurred, triggering what scientists now call the Late Antique Little Ice Age. That's right. It wasn't just one bad year. It was the beginning of a century-long chill. This was the equivalent of Earth getting slapped by volcanic whiplash. Just as people were trying to recover. Boom! Another ash cloud. Now, let's circle back to our regular folks. Imagine living in Scandinavia. Archaeological digs show entire villages were abandoned. Graves from this time suggest extreme malnutrition. And myth. Well, this is where some scholars believe the Norse legend of Fimbulwinter may come from. A great winter that lasts 3 years and leads into Ragnarok, the end of the world. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe when the sun goes missing and everything starts dying, people start writing stories to make sense of it all. But let's not forget the animals. Cattle starved. Bees vanished. Horses couldn't find grass. In areas like Britain, we see sudden population drops, not because of war, but because of ecological collapse. And for humans, it wasn't just hunger. It was psychological terror. Imagine going to bed every night in darkness, only to wake up in the same dull grey. No brightness, no warmth, just the creeping fear that the sun might never return. You'd start to wonder, what did we do wrong? This brings us to a fun thought experiment. What if this happened today? What if tomorrow the sun dimmed to a faint smear in the sky and stayed that way for a year? Food shortages would strike within weeks. Crops would fail. Panic would spiral. Power grids would crash under heating demands. Stock markets would nosedive. TikTok challenges would turn into how to cook with no sunlight. We are no more emotionally prepared for endless twilight than our ancestors were. In fact, in some ways, we're less resilient. So let's pause and appreciate the fact that, as bad as our day might be, at least the sun is out. Or mostly out. Unless you're watching this at night. In that case, hey, you've got electricity, indoor heating, Netflix. Our ancestors, they had prayers, they had stories, and they had each other, huddled around fires in a world that had literally gone dim. So, next time the sky looks gloomy, remember, at least it's not 536. Not yet. Backhand index pointing right. If you were alive in 536, what do you think would have broken you first? The cold, the darkness, or the famine? Let us know in the comments. Imagine walking into your village's granary, only to find it echoing back at you. The bins are hollow. The sacks of barley gone. The air, once fragrant with grains and dried herbs, now smells like cold stone and dust. Outside, the fields are empty, not because of harvest, but because nothing ever grew. This wasn't a bad year. It wasn't even a series of unfortunate weather spells. This was a complete agricultural breakdown, the kind that leaves songs unsung and generations unnamed. As we drift further into the shadow of 536, famine, the quiet killer, tightened its grip across the world. People from Ireland to Constantinople, from the Andes to the Far East, experienced a slow, relentless disappearance of food. In Ireland, records suggest a failure of bread from the years 536 through 539. That's not one missed season. It's multiple consecutive years where even the most basic of sustenance became a whispered memory. Think about that for a second. Bread, the simplest food in most societies, gone. In our modern world, it would be like waking up to find every grocery store empty, every food delivery app showing unavailable, every fridge humming with nothing inside. Now let's wander into the Eastern Roman Empire. Byzantine records, particularly from the historian Procopius, described the sun as dim and the air heavy, symptoms we now know to be signs of a volcanic winter. But back then, it was interpreted as divine anger, a punishment perhaps. Crops failed across the empire. Wheat yields fell so dramatically that city dwellers began to flee to the countryside in search of edible weeds, roots, even insects. Can you hear the eerie silence that follows empty bellies? The absence of children playing, of markets bustling, of laughter around the hearth? Hunger does that. It drains joy first, then strength. And yet, in their resilience, some societies tried to adapt. Let's drift to the highlands of Peru, where the Wari people had once enjoyed a sophisticated system of terraced farming. But even there, elevated fields could not escape the sky's dimmed light and dying warmth. The people turned to preserved foods, buried deep in cool caverns, an ancient form of refrigeration. Yet even those stores, carefully saved for lean months, eventually ran out. The Norse, reliant on barley and fish, suddenly found their fishing waters colder and murkier. Ice formed earlier in the season and stayed far too long. Rivers clogged. Transport stalled. Even the goats and sheep, confused by endless twilight, began to wander oddly. Without consistent daylight, even animals began to act strange, an unsettling reminder that nature itself had fallen out of rhythm. Let me ask you something softly. What would you do if your family had nothing to eat for weeks? And still, the snow didn't melt, and still, the crops didn't rise. These questions weren't hypothetical in 536. They were everyday realities. And famine doesn't just mean hunger. It means the collapse of trade routes as merchants have nothing to sell. It means banditry as the desperate rob the equally desperate. It means entire villages packing up and wandering off into the forests or mountains, hoping that somewhere, anywhere, there's warmth, food, and a forgiving sun. But perhaps one of the saddest echoes of this time came from China. The Northern Wei dynasty collapsed not long after these famines began. One imperial record speaks of yellow fog, dim sun, frost in summer, and famine in every district. Some resorted to eating bark, soil, even the bones of animals long buried. What words are left, when even the land no longer recognizes the season? And yet, through all of this darkness, small stories of endurance still flicker. Some monasteries in Europe opened their cellars to the hungry. Buddhist monks in Asia shared what rice they could. And families, even in famine, found ways to share, to divide one crust of bread 4 ways instead of 2. It's a quiet testament to humanity's stubborn light, even when the sky itself seemed to forget how to shine. Tonight, as you drift deeper into rest, imagine the hush of a world not loud with war or shouting, but with the soft rustle of survival. A woman handing her last bowl of soup to her child. A village elder teaching people which wild roots won't poison them. A monk lighting a candle in a stone chapel, offering prayer not for bounty, but for endurance. This was famine in the year 536. Not just the absence of food, but the presence of quiet suffering, of whispered hope, of an entire planet unsure whether tomorrow would ever look like yesterday again. Sleep now, and breathe in that stillness, knowing the story isn't over yet. A fisherman's wife wakes early, as she always does, in the quiet hours before dawn. Her little hut stands near the blackened shore, once white with salt. She waits for the pale light to seep through the cracks in the walls. But it does not come. Day after day, she wakes in that same waiting, that same dusky silence, her body confused and her spirit slowly unraveling. The sun, she whispers, must have been eaten. And in a way, it had. By now, we begin to understand why scientists call 536 the beginning of the worst time to be alive. But what exactly caused this darkness? What event, or chain of events, could throw half the world into twilight? Historians, climatologists, and volcanologists have traced the origin of the global dimming to one of Earth's most powerful weapons, a supervolcanic eruption. Somewhere, most likely in the northern hemisphere, possibly Iceland, a volcano erupted with such force that it sent ash, sulfate aerosols, and fine volcanic glass high into the stratosphere. This veil of particulate matter formed a blanket above the clouds, blocking sunlight and transforming global weather patterns. The earth cooled, crops failed, rain fell in strange seasons, or not at all. Snow blanketed China in summer. Famine rose in Ireland, and entire regions went silent in the archaeological record, vanishing from trade routes, from temple offerings, from writing and record altogether. From the very beginning of 536, the sun's light was described as like the moon, dim, weak, silvered. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote, "The sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during the whole year." It wasn't just dimmer, it was haunting. A full year passed, and the sun never shone bright again. For ancient people, whose religions depended on celestial order, this was more than terrifying. It was apocalyptic. Even more unsettling, this was only the first eruption. Scientists now believe that a second major volcanic eruption followed around 540, just 4 years later, deeper compounding the effects of the first. This second event might have originated in Central America, perhaps in El Salvador's Ilopango volcano, adding fresh layers of volcanic debris to the already dense shroud above. What does that mean for our sleep story? It means that across the world, people were not just hungry. They were confused, frightened, and grieving the loss of seasons. They buried their dead with no sense of when the next harvest would come. Rituals changed. Some may have turned to human sacrifice, others to new gods, or to old ones they thought they'd forgotten. Darkness has always had a strange hold on the human mind. But this darkness wasn't night. It was a daylight eclipse lasting 18 months. We return now to the hut by the sea. That same fisherman's wife steps outside, blinking at the sky. No clouds, no storm, yet no sun. She cannot mark the time anymore. The stars come earlier. The birds are silent. The sea, usually grey-blue in the morning, is black. She looks to her husband and asks, "Has the world turned?" And in many ways, it had. All across the northern hemisphere, similar thoughts echoed. In Scandinavia, Norse myth begins to record strange motifs: wolves swallowing the sun, skies torn asunder, the world tree trembling. In Mesoamerica, temple priests began recalibrating their calendars, trying to correct something cosmic. In China, where astronomy and astrology were tightly linked to governance, imperial court records reflect confusion, crop failure, and repeated omens. What makes 536 especially remarkable is how interconnected these reactions were, despite vast geographic distances. No phones, no planes, no radios, but everyone everywhere was looking up at the same dimmed sky. And they all wondered, what have we done? Modern scientists, using ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica, have traced the telltale chemical signatures of these volcanic events. Sulfate spikes and layers of volcanic ash match historical records of the sunless years. It's a chilling convergence of myth and material, one that lets us hear the echo of human fear from almost 1,500 years ago. And now we know something else. The consequences were not short-lived. Crops didn't recover the next season. The famines rolled on, especially as weather systems remained chaotic. Trade diminished. Political systems weakened. Entire cities shrank or were abandoned. By the mid-540s, a second blow struck: the Justinian Plague, the first historically recorded pandemic of bubonic plague. So yes, the sun dimmed in 536. But the darkness was not only in the sky. It reached deep into the hearts of those who lived through it. The sunless skies of 536 stretched into months, and then into years. At first, people tried to wait it out, assuming the weather would clear, that the warmth would return, that the grain would grow again. But the seasons did not behave. Spring came with frost. Summer passed with no sun. And by autumn, what little had grown was pitiful. Communities that had thrived just years earlier now clung to survival. In the countryside, peasants scavenged for roots, bark, and edible weeds. In the towns, granaries were emptying, and prices soared for even a few spoonfuls of barley. Hunger changed people. Eyes once bright with laughter grew hollow, watching for bread. Mothers rationed meals, saving the last crumbs for their children. And then came the wolves. Starving predators crept closer to villages, bolder than ever before. There are tales, half lost to time, of livestock vanishing in the night, of dogs turning feral, even of lone children wandering too far from their homes, never returning. Desperation was not limited to the human world. Nature itself was unhinged. Meanwhile, The thin veil between fact and fear began to tear. When people cannot explain why the sun refuses to shine, they reach for myth. Omens, curses, divine punishment, all became explanations. Some believed the world was ending. Others thought their kings had angered the gods. There were whispers of sky serpents swallowing the sun, or vengeful saints casting a dark spell across the land. In Constantinople, Emperor Justinian, already shaken by the plague and revolts, now faced a moral and spiritual crisis. His advisors debated how to respond to what they considered a cosmic sign. Churches held mass prayers. Monks lit candles at noon. The empire teetered not only under physical hardship, but also psychological collapse. And in the West, where the remnants of Roman order still barely lingered, whole settlements were abandoned. Farmers, unable to grow crops, left their land. Small towns emptied out. Trade routes shrank as merchants feared bandits, famine, and pestilence. Even letters from the time seem more sparse, as if people had run out of both parchment and hope. One chronicle from Gaul tells of black skies and thinning blood. Another from Ireland describes a year with no bread. These weren't literary metaphors. They were literal cries for help, preserved on fragile pages through time. Even the trees, those quiet witnesses to history, bore scars of the catastrophe. Scientists have examined tree rings from this period, finding narrow growth, or none at all, for several years. It's as if the very lungs of the earth were gasping. But perhaps the most chilling legacy of 536 was how it reshaped the human experience of time. Before this, people marked years by festivals, harvests, and celestial events. But in the haze of darkness, years blurred. Time felt broken. Calendars stopped aligning with the sky. And when the sun finally returned, dim and weak, it felt like a stranger. For the survivors, life was not just harder. It was different. Rituals had changed. Diets were altered. New religions and beliefs began to stir, shaped by years of darkness and fear. People rebuilt, but not all in the same way. This chapter in history reminds us of something uncomfortable yet vital, that civilization is more fragile than it seems. When the skies turn dark and the crops don't grow, when disease follows famine and fear shadows every step, we are reminded that nature and chance still rule. And yet, they endured. In the next chapter, we follow a caravan moving through the Levant. Traders who braved the darkness, bringing silk, salt, and stories across lands stitched together by desperation and hope. As the skies remained choked with ash and sunlight remained a stranger, another silent catastrophe unfolded across the ancient world: the collapse of trade. In the interconnected web of the 6th century economy, even distant regions depended on one another for goods, supplies, and prosperity. But with harvests failing, cities weakened, and roads growing perilous, the great arteries of commerce slowed, then stopped. Silk caravans that once moved through Central Asia dwindled. Ships that once glided through the Mediterranean's turquoise waters stayed docked. Markets fell quiet. In Constantinople, once the proud capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, traders whispered that the far corners of the world had simply vanished. Goods from India, spices from Ceylon, glass from the Levant, all became rare or disappeared entirely. In Britain, which already teetered on the edge of post-Roman obscurity, the crisis meant isolation. Coins became scarce. Pottery traditions faded. Entire villages simply disappeared from the record. It's as if time slowed, and the island shrank inward, shrouded in both mist and silence. And with the crumbling of trade came a slow erosion of knowledge. Libraries grew colder. Scholars fell silent or fled. Infrastructure deteriorated. Roads cracked. Aqueducts dried. For many, the world was not just ending. It was forgetting. But even in this darkness, seeds of survival took root. In far corners of Europe, monastic communities became sanctuaries of learning. In Ireland, illuminated manuscripts began to appear, glowing like fireflies in the long twilight. In the East, certain cities tried to rebuild, their leaders clinging to structure and law. Recovery would not be quick. In fact, historians believe it took more than a century for populations to return to pre-536 levels in many regions. But the sheer endurance of human society, even when stripped to the bone, is its own kind of miracle. By now, the world had grown still, unervingly still. Fields once golden with wheat lay bare. Roads were choked with thistle and dust. Villages stood empty, as though time itself had passed them by. And then, as if the earth hadn't suffered enough, the skies brought one final omen, the dimming of the moon. Ancient Chinese, Japanese, and Byzantine records alike noted a strange phenomenon. The moon seemed faint, shadowed, as though shrouded in a veil. It cast no comforting glow on the land. Night lost its rhythm. Sleep, already uneasy in a world of ash and hunger, became even more disturbed. Imagine lying in a cold wooden hut, wrapped in tattered wool, the sound of coughing in the next room, and stepping outside to see a moon so dim it barely painted the hills in silver. Something deep in the human soul began to whisper. Had the heavens abandoned them? The air, still heavy with volcanic particles, had not only blotted the sun by day, but dulled the moon's glow by night. In the silence between crickets and coughing, people began to look skyward not with wonder, but with fear. The Sassanid Empire, once powerful in Persia, reported signs of the heavens trembling. Astrologers scoured their texts. Roman officials whispered of divine punishment. Even in the Americas, the Maya and other cultures adjusted their sky charts, puzzled by strange, prolonged celestial dimming. Was the moon sick too? Without light, rituals faltered. Ceremonies timed to moon phases slipped out of sync. Farmers hesitated. Festivals dimmed. Hope, already thin as mist, nearly evaporated. But still people endured. Fires were lit. Songs, hushed and mournful, were passed along. Mothers soothed children with lullabies that reached back into centuries past, anchoring them to stories that outlived empires. And quietly, slowly, the ash began to settle. The stars had always been guides. For sailors drifting across foreign waters, for farmers watching for frost, for lovers murmuring wishes into the night. But during that dreadful time, the time of hunger, shadow, and cold, the stars too were veiled. It was a subtle grief, not as sharp as an empty stomach or as loud as a child's cough, but it crept quietly into hearts across the world. Night after night, the heavens failed to appear. No constellation of hunters, no arc of the Milky Way. Just a dim veil, sometimes pierced faintly by a flicker, more imagined than real. Travelers lost their bearings. Stories once told around firelit gatherings lost their reference points. The cosmos, once a great map of myths and gods, was now a blank parchment. Imagine a shepherd in the Anatolian mountains, cradling a dying lamb beneath a sky he could no longer read. Or a seer in India, incense curling up toward clouds, searching in vain for the alignment of stars that would mark the changing of the season. Even the wise fell silent. But not all was lost. In the high Andes, Quechua women spun wool beneath the clouds, humming ancestral tunes that told of a time before the stars. In the dark hills of Wales, elders recited stories not of what the sky showed, but of how people endured when it showed nothing at all. Across Siberia, shamans turned their prayers inward, searching not the sky, but the dream world, where light still danced in visions. And so, something new began. In the absence of celestial certainty, people looked instead to each other. A starless night forced humans to become one another's compass. They read the tilt of shoulders, the hush of breath, the hush between words. Communities, instead of collapsing, learned again how to gather, not to celebrate, but to survive. To pass the candle, mend the cloth, bury the old, name the newborn, and speak hope into darkness. And at last, one night, someone somewhere looked up and saw Orion's belt, faint but there. A returning. A sign. It did not happen with a roar. There was no trumpet, no sudden joy. Just a soft unfolding. A change so slow, most missed it at first. The skies lightened, barely, in hue. That heavy leaden grey that had hung for months upon months began to pale. And one morning, in a northern village where the grass had not turned green in a year, someone noticed the dew sparkled. Not just wet, but lit. The sun was not bright yet, but it was truer, less choked. It reached across the meadows without that bruised yellow tint. Children, now gaunt but giggling again, ran without coughing. Bees returned in ones and twos, weaving slow gold paths between blooms that had been mere whispers last season. And with the soft light came sound. Not the wheeze of dry throats or the scratch of empty carts, but birdsong, unsure at first, as if testing the air. Then more. A chorus. Then laughter, real laughter, the kind that does not ask permission. Dogs barked again. Wind rustled spring wheat. The rivers, once choked and low, danced over their stones with purpose. In kitchens, stale root cellars were swept out. The first greens, tender, shy, were gathered with reverence. Meals became more than survival again. A touch of spice, a dash of salt, a shared bowl without apology. And so people emerged, not from homes, for many had none, but from stillness, from inside the thick silence of fear. They looked at each other and saw not ghosts, but faces. They whispered names long unsaid. They walked to neighbors and knocked not for help, but to offer it. The monks returned to their bells. The bells returned to the wind. And over time, the sky became something to admire again. Not just to fear or study, but to lean into. Lovers watched it. Parents pointed to it. Sailors sang to it. And when the stars returned, not as bright as before, but blinking faithfully, people wept. They didn't cheer. They wept, because in their silence, they had remembered what it meant to need one another. The world would always be fragile. That truth had rooted deep. But life, even when dim, could still shimmer, still hold, still return. So what does the year 536 teach us, really? First, nature does not mess around. A few volcanoes cough, and suddenly humanity is plunged into a real-life survival horror film. Second, we're incredibly resilient. The people of the 6th century didn't have space, heaters or Uber Eats, but they still found a way to survive. Third, and maybe most importantly, darkness isn't always the end. Sometimes it's just the messy beginning of something new. If this blew your mind even half as much as it did ours, drop a comment below. What would you do if the sun disappeared for a year? Would you hunt squirrels, grow mushrooms, learn how to knit apocalypse sweaters? Subscribe for more chilling, curious, and completely bizarre stories from history. And if you're still awake, sweet dreams, sunshine.